Today on the podcast, we are up to part 4 in our series about Disney designer, the legendary Rolly Crump. We've already covered his years in animation, his early experiences at WED, and also his efforts on the World's Fair. As we left off last time, Rolly was developing unique creations for the Haunted Mansion, spirits and demons entirely different than those that had been previously considered for this attraction. Rolly's concepts came from a mythology of his own making, beings that often had a lesson to impart to viewers. Once the World's Fair was up and running, Rolly was given months to translate his ideas into drawn images and eventually models. During these same months, Walt Disney had many large projects that he was overseeing. Among them was the feature Mary Poppins, which in the fall of 1964 was moving out into a limited release. There was land acquisition for the Florida project, with parcels quietly being arranged by Disney lawyer Bob Foster, and then there was this massive indoor amusement park that Walt was then designing for St. Louis, a park that ultimately would never be built. But later that fall, Walt's attention again shifted back to the mansion, an attraction he wanted to premiere at Disneyland and also, in a slightly different form, configure for that indoor park that was then being developed for St. Louis. And that is where we pick up our story again today. But before we dive in, let me remind you one more time that there was no restraining Rolly, and that in these interviews he lets loose a swear word here and there. So, if you're all good with that, let's get ourselves going. As work on the mansion progressed, designers at WED explored 3 different conceptual approaches to the attraction. The first 2 were based largely on Hollywood genres of horror films. A group that included Claude Coates wished to create scenes that embodied the spookiness of a Gothic horror film. One of the key elements of the Gothic tradition was a piece of property such as the mansion that was tied to a troubled past. The impulse here was to create stages, such as a funeral room, a dark hallway, and even a graveyard at night that would present the visual landscape of suspenseful films, specifically films with supernatural elements in which a troubled past is laid over the present scene. Films from this tradition include The Haunting and 13 Ghosts. Another set of designers, including Mark Davis, was focused on horror mixed with comedy. This too had a set of filmic traditions, including Abbott and Costello Meet the Mummy and Ghost Chasers. Also in this tradition were some recently launched and very successful TV series, including Bewitched and The Addams Family. The third design group, though, had exactly one member, Rolly Crump, who explored how spirits, rather than ghosts of the recently departed, might occupy the mansion. The film touchstones here largely came from new wave cinema centered in France, including films directed by Fellini, films that most Americans likely would not have seen. With the help of his friend and model maker Jack Fergus, Rolly assembled scale models of his creations: the forever melting candleman made of dripping wax, a coffin clock to remind guests that time ultimately would lead to their own deaths, and a demon whose body was made from a mirror so that guests could see their reflections in his skin. Rolly could see that he had a problem. The mansion would need a unifying design, though there were tonal differences between the serious horror and the comedic horror designs. With work, those 2 elements could fit together. They were both mostly focused on images of death, such as a living person trapped in a coffin, and of ghosts, specifically of humans recently departed who had returned to Earth in spectral form. Rolly's designs, however, didn't graph on easily to either design approach. Walt requested a meeting with WED designers to review concepts for the mansion. This meeting likely took place in late fall 1964. All of the designers attached to this project would, through drawings and models, show Walt how their ideas could be incorporated into the mansion. Rolly was also aware of social cliques at WED, which, as he understood them, were largely arranged around age and experience. The older designers tended to stick together, especially as many of them had worked for Disney for decades, dating back to the Depression, which made it difficult for younger designers to be noticed by Walt. At this meeting was Mark Davis, then 51 years old, and also Claude Coates, also 51 years old. Both of them had been with Disney for nearly 30 years, with their early experiences predating Snow White by a couple of years. Rolly, on the other hand, was just 34, and he felt that again, whether this was planned or whether it was just the natural outworking of longtime friendships, that the older designers would demonstrate a sense of collaboration that would guide Walt to their designs while minimizing or even excluding elements that Rolly wanted to put in the attraction. The presentation was held in a conference room where WED artists set up displays to showcase their visions for the mansion.
And I had all my sketches, and so it was time to have a meeting with Walt. Meanwhile, Claude and Mark and Chuck Mile were working on other aspects of it. Well, they designed the room that when Walt came in, he sat here at the table. There was a long table, and their artwork and stuff was on this wall, that wall, and this wall. And over in the corner, they put Rolly, okay, with my table and my sketches. And so we had the 3-hour meeting. And finally, Walt said to everybody, he says, "This it?" And Dick says, "Yeah, this is it." And he says, "Well, what's this stuff in the corner?" And they said, "Well, that's something Rolly did." He said, "What is it that Rolly did?" And they said, "We don't know. Why don't you ask him?" I mean, this is the kind of dialogue that went on. So he says, "Roland, what is it, or Rolly?" And I said, "I just don't, went through the whole thing. I told him about how I was influenced and everything." So he and I scooted our chairs over there. Mm-hmm. And I'm taking him through all this stuff and telling. He says, "Yeah, but Rolly, this is weird." I says, "Yeah, I know it's weird." He said, "Well, how are you going to use it?" I said, "I don't know how I'm going to use it." I said, "I'm just trying to develop a mood." "Yeah, but how are you going to use it?" "I don't know." So we got into this, how you use it, I don't know, about 3 times. And finally, Walt stood up and says, "I'm out of here." And he left. And everybody said to me, "Well, see, we told you he wouldn't like it." Because they used to come to me and say, "That stuff's too weird. Walt's not going to like it." I said, "Yeah, but I'm having fun." The next morning, I come to work and Walt's sitting in my chair. He's still in the same clothes that he had on when he left. And he said, "You son of a bitch." And I said, "Yes." And he says, "I didn't sleep a wink last night." He says, "Up all night long thinking about what you showed me yesterday." And he says, "I figured it out." And Jack Fergus was there with me, the two of us. And I said, "Oh, thank God." I said, "Well, what is it?" And he said, "We're going to do a museum of the weird. We're going to go out throughout the world and collect all this weird stuff, and we're going to bring it to Disneyland, and we're going to put it in a museum. And when people get through with going through the mansion, they have to go through the Museum of the Weird to come back into Disneyland." So I said, "Sounds good to me." So by this time, Dick Irvine's coming to work late, saw Walt's car in the garage, and it's walking around the model shop with 2 cups of coffee trying to find Walt. And I'm looking at him, "Dick, excuse me, he's over here." So he came over, and Walt said to him, he said, "Get the rest of the guys in here." He says, "I know what we're going to do with Rolly's stuff." And so Dick brought all the guys out, all 6, 8 of them or whatever, and Walt took a half hour to explain to him what the Museum of the Weird was going to be. And then he turned around and says, "Now I'm going to go home and go to bed." And he left. And they all said, Rolly, we knew you had something. We knew you had something. And at that time I realized, God, these guys are something else again.
Not long after this, Walt asked Rolly again to be on his weekly TV show, an episode celebrating Disneyland at the start of its 10th year. During the first segment, Walt talked with various designers developing new attractions for Disneyland. This was filmed on a soundstage, but the set was arranged to look like the model shop at WED. For the most part, Walt talked to his older and more seasoned designers. John Hench, then 56 years old, discussed the forthcoming Plaza Inn. Mary Blair, then 53, discussed the transition of It's a Small World from the New York World's Fair to Disneyland once the fair finished its second season. Claude Coates discussed Pirates of the Caribbean. Mark Davis discussed the humorous portraits in the mansion's soon-to-be-built stretching room. And then, a whole generation younger than everyone else, Rolly Crump discussed the Museum of the Weird. This is the audio from Rolly's appearance on TV.
Roland, I want you to meet Julie Reams. She is Miss Disneyland Tencennial. This is Roland Crump, who for the project here is sort of acting as the interior decorator of a house of illusion. What do we call it?
Museum of the Weird.
Museum of the Weird. Will you tell her about some of these things, Roland?
These are going to be collected from all over the world, supposedly, and we're going to have man-eating plants, and we're going to have a coffin clock here that we're working on right now. We have a gypsy cart that comes to life with ghosts inside of it. We have a candle man. These are just things that are collected from all over the world. Just the weirdest things we could find.
Yeah, we're also collecting real ghosts to bring here. You believe in ghosts, don't you, Julie?
No.
You don't?
Not really.
According to Rolly, this was done in a single take. And afterwards, one of the longtime Disney art directors took him aside.
And it was really kind of sweet because McLaren Stewart was one of the directors. He came to me after the shoot, and he said, Rolly, I just want you to know that they gave a list of 8 different designers to talk about the Haunted Mansion. And he said, and Walt chose you. So I thought that was awfully sweet of Mac to tell me that.
During these same months, late in 1964 and in 1965, Rolly worked on another project, creating an eventual home for It's a Small World at Disneyland. This attraction couldn't leave the fair site in New York until fall 1965, and it wouldn't open at Disneyland until the middle of 1966. But long before the fair started its second season, Rolly was planning for its arrival. The California version of It's a Small World, though reusing the dolls and the stages from the fair, would have many improvements and enhancements once it arrived in California. First of all, it would have a new facade, something that would be far more beautiful and ornate than the corrugated barn that then housed the attraction in New York. The plan as it existed in the winter of 1964 was to bring home the Tower of the Four Winds, to paint it white, and then to set it beside an elaborate new facade, also white, that would grace the entrance to the attraction. Walt asked Mary Blair to design the exterior, something that spoke to the architecture of the world, but as everyone on the WED team soon understood, Mary's imagination, at least in terms of architecture, was best expressed in 2 dimensions. Her paintings, though colorful and playful, existed on a flat plane, but Rolly's imagination worked in the exact opposite way. From his early days at Disney, he had imagined art in multiple dimensions. From his early propeller and mobile art to his tikis to the Tower of the Four Winds. His strength in dimensional presentation would become a bridge that transformed Mary Blair's 2-dimensional designs for the facade exterior of It's a Small World in terms of how this would be developed in California.
Mary was a stylist beyond styling, but she only thought flat. Mm-hmm. And so when she came out, and then this gets back to Dick Irvine, really, see, Walt was the best casting director that ever lived. He knew exactly who to put on what. And so, because he never would have said, Herbie, I want you to design the tower. He said, no, Rolly designs the tower. So, and that's why he put Claude and Mark together on doing rights, because Claude did the background and Mark did the animation. So he knew that formula. So what happened was Mary was brought out to do the facade. Well, she wasn't sticking with her original illustrations that she did. She started just getting had all the kids in the model shop building blocks of wood. And so she'd sit there like a little girl putting these blocks of wood together to design this without any illusion of the acreage that it was going to take up. Or any knowledge of that. And so I went out to Mary, and it was just hodgepodge. It was horrible. And I said, Mary, you know, you need to build the armature of how you get into the ride, how you get out, and everything. So you look at it and she says, well, how do you build an armature? And I realized that she couldn't think three-dimensional at all. So we had a meeting with Walt, and it really was very poorly done. And Walt didn't like it at all. And he just basically turned to Mary and said, and I don't want to blame Mary, because she was asked by Dick Irvine to do it, and she was trying to do the best she could, but it was his mistake to even ask her. So he says, I don't think we can do this. We got to take another approach on this. Well, she went and had 6 martinis and went home. Got a plane and went home. So I'd already started doing study models myself personally of what the facade should look like, and I still have one of the original study models at my house that I did. And so I went into Dirk Irvine's office and I said, I'll design the facade for you. I said, that's no big deal. I said, but I'm not answering to anybody but Walt. So he says, don't worry. He didn't want any part of that. So I got Fred Jerger, and Fred and I went out, and I used Mary's sketches. I started laying everything out in black and white squares in cardboard. I've got photos of all of this. And in 7 days, we designed the facade, A Small World, in black and white cardboard. And it was kind of a cute story, because we had the box that represented the building, and then we had the facade in the cardboard cutouts. And Fred and I had all these little trees that we were going to put around in the front to kind of show foliage, but we didn't have any place to put them, so we were reaching from the table over here to put them there. So I said, Fred, let's lay the table that's got this piece of plywood with all the trees on it up on top of the building, and then we'll take them down and we'll put them where we want them. Make it easier to. Fred said, fine. So we're in the process of taking these little trees down and placing them, and Walt comes in early. And he gets down there and he's looking at what we're doing, and we're going, well, we're not quite ready yet, Walt. He said, no, it's fine. And he says, the one thing I like what you guys are doing, he says, you're putting trees on the roof, and that way the public won't know there's a building there. And Fred and I looked at him and said, well, yeah, we thought that was a good idea. And then Fred and I looked at each other, and he looked at us, it's kind of funny. Then Fred and I looked at each other and started laughing. We said, no, Walt, we just put him up there to get easy to get to because of the model. And Walt said, I don't care. He says, I still think it's a good idea. And for years, there were trees up on the roof, but they're not there much anymore. The maintenance is too much. No. But that's how that got there. So then Walt took one look at it and said, okay, go for it. And so then what we did was I started doing a wooden model. I had Jack Fergus working with me, building the wooden model. So as Jack was finishing the wooden model and putting it up there, the architects and the engineers would come out and set their table up and reach over and take the model out and trace it, and then put it back. And that's how it was designed from an engineering standpoint. And then I get a call from Irvine. He says, Walt's going to come over and take a look at the facade on a buy-off.
By this point, the model included architectural icons of the world, the Eiffel Tower, the Taj Mahal, and the Leaning Tower of Pisa. In ways, the facade looked like an enormous paper cutout of the most famous buildings of the world all glued together. Walt signed off on it. This new facade with the existing Tower of the Four Winds, with all of its movement, would pair well together. But Walt also wanted to further develop the interior of the ride, adding entire new show stages to the attraction for when it came to California.
I designed 2 new areas that wasn't in the World's Fair. The first area that you came into was the Eskimos on the left. So that was a whole new piece that was there. The ice skater that's on the right had already been in the earlier part. And then I did a whole island section that wasn't at the World's Fair. So we added, and then I elongated some of the sets so that they filled the space more. Yeah, because that's 50,000 square feet down there. In fact, it's so big, they ended up putting a paint shop behind some of the sets. You know where the bell ringers are? Yeah. There's a paint shop behind the little sets. There was so much space that they could use behind the scenes that they had.
This concept of functionality was a relatively new idea for Rolly, something that he had absorbed after spending time at Disneyland. By this point in his career, more than most designers, he understood that the type of entertainment art that they created for the park also needed to be maintained, repaired, and refurbished. It wasn't pure art. It was functioning art that needed to be repaired. And so he looked for ways to incorporate these needs into his projects.
The one thing that I did do, when we got to the World's Fair, there was no way to repair or get up to the animation. There was no space behind the sets. So when we did the one at Disneyland, I laid out walkways first before I brought the sets in so that we'd have good circulation for the maintenance people.
But as plans progressed, Walt felt that the facade structure, with its lovely silhouettes of international architecture, might not be enough to capture the interest of the public for more than a few seconds. He thought it should have more, specifically more movement, maybe some type of clock at its center with whimsical designs, and maybe some figures that appeared on the quarter hour. Again, Walt asked Mary Blair to design a clock with fanciful elements and a childlike charm, and then again asked Rolly to translate those designs into something that might exist in real space.
When I did the Small World clock, it was Walt's idea to do the clock, okay? So I built this model of the clock, and it actually ran just like the one at Disneyland. It was a little, I think it was a half-inch model, no, it was an inch model of the clock. And I had Ken Forsey build all the mechanism inside of it to make it work. And there's a picture of Walt and I looking at it. You've probably seen that where we're smiling. But before I showed it to Walt, Dick Irvine came out and said, I want to see the clock before Walt does. And I said, okay. So I ran it for him. And he says, oh, no. He says, it's no good. He said, you don't have a rooster crowing. He says, you don't have a guy ringing the bell. I mean, he started describing what all the old clocks are like in Europe. And he said, it doesn't have a good finale. He says, I think we'll get Mark Davis to redesign it. Well, I'd spent 2 months putting this together. So I said, well, do you mind if we show it to Walt? He said, no, you show it to Walt. I showed it to Walt. Walt didn't say a word the first time he saw it. Then the second time was when he took the picture and he was kind of pointing and laughing. So Dick Irvine said the exact same thing. He says, Walt, I don't think it's got a good finale. He said, I think we should get Mark Davis to redesign it. And Walt looked him straight in the eye and he says, I like it exactly the way it is. And walked away. See, now, the sad thing about it is, the reason that they had concerns with me is because he used to come out and visit with me when I was doing stuff. He knew what I was doing. He wasn't a stranger to the projects that I was working on. And not only that, he would give me assignments. I think she and I both feel that Irvine was jealous of the fact that Walt and I were close, and he shouldn't do that because, first of all, he wasn't a designer; he was an administrator. But he was okay, you know.
And with this, Rolly could see that there were consequences for being friends with Walt, especially as he was so much younger than the other WED designers. He felt a quiet resentment and small notes of jealousy. The older WED artist understood that Rolly, with his wildness and directness, connected with Walt in a way that they didn't, or perhaps in ways that they no longer did. For many of them, Claude Coates, Mark Davis, Blaine Gibson, and others, they had all been closer to Walt decades earlier, when together they were inventing how Disney animation would be arranged for full-length motion pictures. Many of them talked about these years, the late 1930s and early 1940s, as creative high points in their careers, when Walt was mixed in closely with his artists. And now they saw another young person, in certain ways, occupied this favored spot, a place that they each once had cherished. These problems would move forward in Rolly's life, as would problems on the various attractions on which he worked. The next problem for the Small World project involved the Tower of the Four Winds.
what happened was Walt wanted to bring the tower back to Disneyland. Meanwhile, I'd already designed the facade and the clock, and to put the tower there in front of the clock, it would have been, confetti. So I really didn't want to do that, and so I was called in by Dick Irvine. He says, "You're in the hot seat." Well, there was Joe Fowler, there was Roger Brogy, Mel Melton, all the key guys, and we're sitting there, and what Irvine says, he said, "We don't want the Tower of Four Winds to come back." And I said, "Well, neither do I." And they said, "But we want you to tell Walt." Can you believe that? So I sat there, and it was the damnedest thing, because I used to have I had a beautiful little habit. Whenever I had a chance, I'd sit next to Walt, and when the meetings were over with, I'd always grab his coat tail when he was getting up, and I'd ask him about, is there anything I missed? I want to make sure I understood, And he was really sweet. He'd always sit down and say, "Now, Rolly, da-da-da-da-da-da." Or he'd sit down and say, "Rolly, I don't know," so it was funny. So anyway, we were sitting in the meeting, and we had the meeting about the World's Fair coming back to California. And finally Walt said, "Was that it?" And I said, "Well, about the tower." And he said, "What about the tower? That's the eyebrow thing." Mm-hmm. And I said, "I don't want it to come back." He said, "What do you mean you don't want it to come back?" I said, "I just, how I feel about it. It's fat and ugly, and I don't want it to come back." And then he sat there for a minute or two, and then he looked at all these guys. And he turned over to Mel Melton. He says, "Do you have a concern about the cost of bringing it back?" And Mel said, "Well, there's a little cost, but, a little concern, but no, Walt, no, if you want to bring it back, Mel Melton, okay, and then he would go over to Roger Brogy. "Roger, are you concerned about having to make sure that the maintenance on this?" "Oh, yeah, well, we do have a concern, but, so every one of them backed down. Not one of them said, why they believed it shouldn't come back. Mm-hmm. So after the meeting was over with, and we're sitting there, and Walt says, "Okay, we won't bring it back."
And in this, what was again on display for everyone to see was the natural closeness that Rolly had with Walt. Rolly could tell Walt that he didn't want the tower to return, but everyone else shied away from the topic as they felt it might be controversial.
Well, they all were out of the room in 2 seconds flat.
Yeah.
And I caught his coattail, and I said, "Does it really bother you?" Because I said to him, it's an awkward time to bring it back and putting it in front of the clock, because I said, then you've got confetti on confetti. And I could see that Walt understood what I said. And so when I said that to him, he said, "No." He says, "It's okay." So I feel bad that it got cut up into 2-foot lengths and thrown into the ocean, but it was meant for the World's Fair, and that's where it belonged, and and I felt that the clock really represented what we should have at Disneyland, and not clutter it up. And Walt saw that. I told Walt one time, I said, "If we can ever build a building big enough to put a tower in, I'd love to do it again, to where we can control the look and the color and everything." And he just looked at me and said, "Well, someday, Rolly."
On Monday, May 30th, Disneyland arranged a grand opening ceremony for It's a Small World. The ceremony began with a parade on Main Street. It featured 500 children from 18 nations dressed in traditional costumes. Some children were arranged into marching bands, others into troops of folk dancers. Walt himself rode in his electric roundabout car, a replica of a 1900s curved dash Oldsmobile. The procession ended at the Small World facade, now beautifully arranged in tones of white and gold. From there, Walt joined a group of children out on the ride's center load island. At the microphone, Walt told the crowd, "When we completed It's a Small World for presentation at the World's Fair, we felt that we had accomplished what we had set out to do. We wanted to foster a better understanding among the nations of the world by showing the dress, the costumes, the language, the music, and a little of the culture of our neighbors around the world." Then, when he was finished, a few fireworks blossomed above the structure. Walt, on that day, was halfway through his 65th year. People around him could see that he was tired, though his hair was dyed when he filmed introductions for his weekly TV show. For the most part now, it was streaked with gray. He'd put on weight and moved slower than he had a few years earlier. He believed that some of the pain he presently felt was related to an old polo injury that damaged his neck and shoulder. His symptoms, though, were actually related to a far more serious disease, one that remained, at least for now, undetected. Shortly after Small World opened, Walt made assignments for the park's next big project, a complete reimagining of Tomorrowland. Tomorrowland would absorb the Carousel of Progress from the World's Fair. It would also absorb the ride system from the Ford Pavilion, though the Magic Skyway, which was the main Disney attraction in the Ford Pavilion, didn't come back to Disneyland. Small sections of it did. The dinosaurs from that attraction were arranged alongside the Disneyland Railroad to create Primeval World, and the inventive ride system from the Ford Magic Skyway became the basis for the People Mover, another key attraction for this update to Tomorrowland, a project that was quickly renamed Tomorrowland 67. For this project, Rolly designed 2 shops. He designed new ticket booths. He also designed the hidden bandstand that would rise up out of the ground, a structure later known as Tomorrowland Terrace. But Walt wouldn't see any of these projects complete. He died that December after doctors discovered cancer filled his lungs. He died on December 15, 1966. It was a Thursday. That day, many employees at the studio and at WED simply went home. By this point, Rolly had worked for Disney for 14 years. For the last 7, he'd worked for WED, the special division devoted to theme park design, overseen directly by Walt. At WED, Walt's absence allowed the balance of power to shift significantly toward the older designers, those with seniority. In terms of the mansion, this team felt it best to return its designs to the more familiar world of film-like entertainment, something whose tones better matched the whole of Disneyland.
And Walt always said that people like to be scared, and so we got to make the Haunted Mansion scary. Well, Dick Irvine said, no, they never wanted a scary mansion. So there was some controversy there. But I remember Walt saying, people like to be scared, so we got to scare them in there. So anyway, there was a lot of contradiction going on.
But also during these months, there wasn't time to fully re-engage design work for the mansion, as the company had already announced that the revised Tomorrowland would open at the start of summer. Though Walt's absence was felt by all the designers, they mostly focused on their work, believing that that is what Walt would want them to do.
I always worked with all the trades like I was one of them. Mark Davis and Clyde Coates would come in and they would wave their arms and they'd be in suits and they would do this and they had their lists and stuff. I go down there with my brown bag and eat with the carpenters, when we were doing it, when we were installing Small World. So I worked very hard to have a good rapport with that level of people. And I remember I did the ticket booths for Tomorrowland. When the ticket booth finally got built, it was done off of some drawings that were done in Chaussette. They were clumsy, and I wanted them to be, I wanted the little spirals that came up, I wanted to extend them a little bit and make them thinner looking. So I went to the guys in the mill and I said, I would really like to put those little those little guys that go up, I want to put a little rod on them and I'll make them a little higher. And they looked at me and said, Rolly, it's not in our budget. It's not in our budget. No, can't do that. I said, really? Yeah, really, it's in our budget. But would you do it for me? Oh, yeah. You know what I mean? I never pulled that very often. That's the only time I ever pulled it.
And bit by bit, he finished his projects for Tomorrowland. More significantly, as he worked with the construction and fabrication teams, he was able to guide his work so that it had a lightness and finesse to it, the exact design qualities he had believed had been missing from the finished Tower of the Four Winds. With the work arranged at the park, for a while, His job felt normal again, as though nothing had changed. But then, as this land was opened, Rolly and most of the designers felt the heaviness of the time, how everything in the future would now be different than those things that were in the past.
And then after we did this was really one of the saddest times. We went down there one night to cut the cord to go into the new Tomorrowland, and Walt wasn't there for the next assignment. And you just felt lost. You just thought, what the hell are you going to do? Well, Irvine didn't want me to get involved with the mansion at all. So he sent me to Disneyland, exiled me to Disneyland to be supervising art director for Disneyland.
Rolly believed that his transfer from WED to Disneyland was largely to keep his voice out of design meetings. His transfer wasn't permanent, but it would be enough time for Dick Irvine to reframe the management hierarchy of WED now that Walt was gone, and to create a system of supervisors and assistants all focused on the same goal. Rolly loved his work at Disneyland. Outside of the attractions, he was largely in charge of how the park appeared, from wall paint to queue elements to artificial plants to lampposts to decorative trash cans and so on. He redesigned the lighting system in Tomorrowland, giving the space a deeper sense of shadow and mystery. He designed new gift shops and stages along the rivers of America where jazz bands performed at night. Of course, Rolly was aware that the WED team was finishing work on Haunted Mansion, an attraction that finally opened nearly 3 years after Walt died.
Once Irvine called me in after the mansion was finished, he said, "What did you think of the mansion?" I said, "Do you have a month to listen to me?" And he didn't want to hear from me at all. Yeah.
But even though his Museum of the Weird was never built, he was still able to find elements of his designs inside the mansion. There were design fragments for his talking chair arranged into a normal chair inside the mansion. Just before Madame Leota's seance room was a remade version of his coffin clock, and then there was this element from the Museum of the Weird as well.
In fact, the one man-eating plant design was taken by Claude Coates, and he did the wallpaper in the Haunted Mansion with that design. So I thought that was kind of interesting. So I finally got some of my artwork in the mansion, but it was via him.
As WED refocused its energies to create Disney World, Rolly was brought back from Disneyland and again became a WED designer, this time focused on the Magic Kingdom.
Wanted me to do Small World for Florida and the Toad Ride for Florida, so I did that.
But WED was different now, more structured, a little more corporate. At times, designers talked about their years with Walt, about the tremendous creativity that had blossomed during that time. But some of the specialness was gone now, fading away as though Rolly perhaps had imagined some of the closeness he'd once felt with Walt. All the longtime designers were, in ways, equals now, each of them having their own unique relationship with the old boss, their own set of stories. But then there was the day that Rolly saw Walt's brother up in Club 33, a private club recently opened in Disneyland. Roy was older than Walt. He was a thin man with kind eyes and gray hair neatly clipped above his ears. He was now in charge of the company. Rolly, of course, knew who he was and could recognize him by sight, but Roy tended to stay out of the creative areas of the company, choosing instead to focus on its business concerns.
I was at the 33 Club having lunch one time, and Roy was there. I never met Roy, and Roy walked up to me and said, "Are you Roy?" I said, "Yeah." He says, "My brother used to talk about you a lot." I go, "Oh, shit." I mean, I never thought that Walt would ever talk about me at all. So I thought that was awful sweet of him to do that.
And this was a story that stayed with Rolly, an understanding that Walt was not only important to his life, but that he was somehow important, at least at times, to Walt as well. Maybe it was his directness, or even his youthful fire, or his ability to try anything. Rolly would never know exactly why Walt had talked about him with his family, but that it had happened at all now deeply mattered to him. In the years ahead, Rolly would work on the Magic Kingdom and later on Epcot. He would eventually have his own design firm and work for parks such as Knott's. But now, as the company was gearing up to design the Magic Kingdom in Florida, Rolly was coming up on his 40th birthday. He was now entering middle age. He was a vastly different person, he knew, than the young man who had come to Disney to be an entry-level animator nearly 2 decades ago. He was also one of the few young artists who had had a close working relationship with Walt. This, too, he sensed would matter. But at least for now, he settled in to draft up designs for a new Toad ride in Florida. This time the attraction would have 2 tracks, not just one, and also some designs for a new version of Small World. As the company moved into Florida, and then eventually to regions beyond. I'll be back next Sunday with a new episode. At least right now, the plan is to record the next part in our story of Disney designer Herb Ryman. And in that story, we are now up to the section where Ryman begins his work on Disneyland. And in case you missed it, last week we put up 2 episodes. So in your feed right before this one is the story of Walt Disney, Winsor McCay, and the origins of American animation. Lastly, we're an ad-free, listener-supported podcast. We do just 2 things: deep dives on stories related to the history of the Disney studio and the parks, and news and analysis of current events as they relate to the Disney company. We are funded entirely by listener contributions. On Bandcamp, you'll find over 200 episodes not available on iTunes or anywhere else. But the best reason to join is to support the work we do here and to make sure that this podcast continues to exist. You can become a monthly subscriber at dhipodcast.bandcamp.com. I'll also leave a link down in the show notes. Until next Sunday, this is Todd James Pierce.